With data analytics and storytelling, there's several parts to it. So the first part is gathering information, and advisors know how to kind of delegate this to their team. They'll be like, hey, track all the leads and put them in some Excel sheet somewhere and tell me where they came from. So they're trying to do the input. Their team is trying to do the input. The analyze part is where we start getting lost.
Welcome, Model FAs. David DeSalle here, president of Model FA and your host of the Model FA podcast. And we have a special guest today. I'm really excited for this conversation. Erica Pauly and her company, which I'll go through the full bio here in a moment. But one of the things that they specialize in is helping advisors track various metrics of their business. And if this isn't your first episode listening, you already know that I got my career started at Northwestern before entering into the consulting and independent space of advisors. And one of the things that Northwestern did really, really good at was tracking various metrics in the business. But Erica gives a little bit of a different perspective to be able to share, how you can kind of tell stories through what we're measuring within our business. So without further ado, Erica Pauly is the founder of Track That Advisor, which is a data analytics company founded in 2015. And they advise on more than $3 billion of both new annuity and AUM business each year for independently owned advisory offices across the nation. She's created KPIs and benchmarking in an industry that hasn't really had them previously. And in her unique approach to data storytelling, which I alluded to, brings a fresh perspective and holistic view to advisory offices across the nation. So with that, Erica, welcome to the show.
Thank you, David. I'm glad to be here.
So you got started in 2015 with this business. I'm curious to know what was going on before that. How'd you kind of get into this industry, or, what were you doing before? And what was kind of that aha moment that you said, I need to start a company and solve this problem that I'm seeing? How'd you get started?
Yeah. So I worked for a financial advisor. So it started many years ago, over a decade, 2009, I think I started with them and was doing all of their marketing. And they came back from an event, and some guy that they knew out in Ohio wasn't doing seminars anymore. And they were like, we don't want to do seminars. We don't think they work really well. We don't like doing them. So, we don't want to do them anymore. And I'm sitting here like, I don't know if that's a great idea. I'm pretty sure there are a lot of our profit coming in. And I had no data to back it up. And I'd been working with them for a really long time. And so I just went into problem solving mode. And I said, I know I can get this. I can prove to them within the numbers of why this might not be the best idea. And so that was how my journey started in tracking long before Track That Advisor ever came about. So I started doing that, not behind their back, but I just said, look, I'm going to go start investigating and to see where we end up. And so I was doing it in my little hole and closed office behind their backs. And 6 months later, I came and I sat them down and I said, here's the picture. Here's what happened the last 6 months. Here's what's happening with seminars. They are the bread and butter of what we're doing, and they are what's creating our high profit margins. And if you quit them, this is detrimental to the company. And they said, oh, okay. The numbers don't lie. They poked holes at it and wanted to prove me wrong. And I had everything to back it up and say, no, this is exactly what happened. This is our spend. This is our revenue that was generated. And after that meeting, I just realized how much I loved it and how easy it came to me. And so I did that for them for years. And then my husband got another job in another state, and I was devastated. And to honor him, we moved. And so they called me up about 6 weeks after we had moved. I just had a baby, and they said, look, we'll hire the marketing part. We'll hire out all the stuff you were doing, but can you just keep doing the tracking? Like, this doesn't exist in our industry. No one's doing it. And I said, absolutely. Why don't I start a little company and you can be my first clients, and let's just see how this thing pans out. And that's how Track That Advisor began. It was something I'd done for a long time. I had no intention of actually starting a company. I don't feel like I'm an entrepreneurial mind. I'm very much the data mind, but I saw a problem and I solved it. And so that is how it was birthed. And now we're solving that problem for lots of advisors around the nation. Like my bio says, I'll be looking at close to $4 billion of new assets. So a lot of money coming in, a lot of leads coming in, which is pretty cool. I can help advisors to tell what's going on in the nation now. So
there's an important lesson in there that oftentimes, whether you're an advisor or just a business owner, regardless of the industry, I feel like folks are quick to make decisions based on emotion or intuition. And oftentimes they can be right, especially when they're following their intuition and they got a good pulse on, what's going on in their business. But they almost made a really bad decision because they didn't have the data that they could kind of prove that it was working or that it was not working. And they just, came high off of, I think you said a conference or some sort of program where they said, hey, seminars are dead. And they were going to make a pretty detrimental decision to the business just based on the emotion that they were feeling after that event. So I think it's a really important lesson that, making data-driven decisions really help with the decision making as opposed to just, trust in, your emotion at the time. So I think that's really cool.
And also to that point, a lot of advisors are salespeople and they get into this because they're really good at sales. But owning an advisory practice, you also have to have that CEO hat. And the sales hat is like the fast, the speedboat, like, we'll change direction here and there. We go off of gut, we go off into intuition. And that, like, to your point, it's not bad. But there are times that you need to sit back and reflect and like put that CEO hat on. And a lot of them don't know how to do that. And that's also where getting good data and getting good reporting is helping them, because they didn't get into this industry because they wanted to be some CEO. They got into it because they're good at sales, and really teaching them the differentiation between the two. When you're in the boardroom, you sell. When you're outside of it, we need to be functioning like that CEO and not make those rash decisions. But that's hard because that's not their nature. So I wanted to point that out, on that those speedboat mentality is pretty common for most of them. And it's a learned characteristic to become data informed decision makers.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a good point in that a lot of advisors get into the business for the reason that you mentioned. They're good at sales. They want to help people. And all of a sudden they're like, shit, I actually have a real business now. I just have no idea how to run it. So I think that to a certain degree, it can be learned and you can take off one hat and put on another. And in other scenarios, you bring someone in that can help you with that. I don't know if you've read the book Traction and the EOS system, but they talk about having a visionary and an integrator that kind of plays off of each other well. And we have this exercise within our coaching program called an energy audit, basically making sure that you're spending your time and energy on things that give you energy and not on the things that don't. But your business needs to grow to a certain point to where you can pull in the other people that have, complementary skill sets. And the journey on the way there, you are required to wear multiple hats. So I think that partnering up with someone like you that helps alleviate the data gathering, like that initial, like, I don't want to do this, can help a lot. And I'm curious to know, within the business, what activity should be tracked? Like, what activity are you actually helping advisors track? Because it is very rare that I come across an advisor that's super dialed in and knows all their business metrics outside of, like, their P&L. So what are some of those things that should be tracked?
Yeah. I use the analogy a lot. If anyone's ever heard me speak, I mean, you probably heard this analogy of stars versus constellations. So within any organization, the data points that you could track is in the thousands. And our sheets and our trackers actually do track thousands of data points. But I'm always very quick to remind people that not all of them matter for every office. So I'll give you kind of some staples that really are important to look at. There's probably 5 or 6 that are pretty consistent, and every office really needs to look at them. But beyond that, most offices and most advisory practices kind of build out their own constellation, depending on if they're wanting to scale, depending on if they want to be high profit, depending on if they're AUM heavy or annuity heavy. I mean, every office is totally different. They have different goals, they're different personality types. So we track lots and lots of things. I will boil it down to maybe 5 that are the most important, but I do always want to make sure people understand there's tons of data points. If you can get them all, great, but that doesn't mean they all make sense to study within your office. So really focusing on, you create your own constellation of what matters to you right now, and it might change in 3 years, but knowing that what matters to that guy over there may not actually be a part of your story and may not even be important for you at all. So, okay, top 5 things to track. This is what everybody always asks. So stick rate, what we're talking about is of the people who set a first appointment, how many keep it. And another thing that's important when data is understanding the definition behind it. So if I just say stick rate, or you're talking to another advisor and someone says stick rate, they could mean a couple different things there. So it's always really important that you're understanding what everyone's talking about in the room.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what we're talking about with stick rate. One way to figure that and what makes it the most accurate is if you remove future first appointments. So from a math standpoint, if we say we have 10 appointments, right, the 10 people that set an appointment and 5 have kept, well, you're sitting at a 50% stick rate there. But we forgot to include the fact that there's like 3 that are in the future. They haven't even had a chance to stick yet. And so you kind of need to subtract that out of the set number.
Yeah, let me dive into that so I have a good understanding.
Yeah.
You're saying that of the 5 that did not stick, there may be 3 that didn't cancel, but they're in the midst of rescheduling. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Or their appointments even in the future, like their appointments are 3 or 4 days. So sometimes staff is like adding up the numbers. They have all these appointments that have been set and they haven't even had a chance to keep them yet. So stick rates you down.
Understood. Gotcha.
So that's how we figure stick rate. So we're removing firsts and taking those that stick. So that's the first one. Benchmark there. We can talk benchmarks later, but what we advise or recommend is that it's hitting 70% or above. Used to be 80, but year over year started dropping. So we are now to 70. Then we have the close rate. So close rate is of the people who kept a first appointment, how many became clients. That's the most typical industry norm that most people, when they're throwing out, percentages at conferences, that's what they're using. But that's typically what we look at is kept first to client. And that is 30% benchmark. And I think it's worth stating, that's 7 no's out of 10 people. And I think a lot of advisors think it should be higher. And they're like, I feel so defeated. I should be like a 50 or a 60. That's not true. I study data all day long. And I really want to encourage advisors that a 30% close rate is actually benchmark. So hopefully that's encouraging to anybody.
I want to hit on that for a minute. And I'm kind of like chuckling internally because I've heard from advisors a lot that I just need to get in front of someone and I close them almost 100% of the time. And there's this like illusion, and it may even just be a natural defense mechanism where they just forget about the scenarios where it didn't work out. Because what you're saying with the benchmarking, and those are the numbers that I agree with based on kind of how I was brought up in Northwestern system and just kind of like intuitiveness, not everyone's going to work with you. But the problem that I find advisors will experience when they think they're closing everyone that they're having an opportunity to meet with is that the front end, the marketing engine, they don't need to get introduced or find as many people because they think when they find them, they're going to become a client. But what you're saying through that data is, hey, if we're going to hit your X, Y, and Z goals, we need to really fill up the front end of the funnel because data is data. Someone may have a 50% compared to the benchmark of 30, but I think we should all be able to agree that regardless of your industry, regardless of your experience, you're not closing 100% of people that, you're meeting with, or even 90%. And there's kind of like a misconception there that advisors find themselves experiencing.
They do. And I don't blame them because a lot of them started off doing like referral business. And referrals close really high. Mm-hmm. And I think that they get that seed planted of, oh man, I've got a really killer close rate. And as you grow and as you scale, we start doing the dinner seminars or we start doing radio or whatever that looks like. And they still have that old vision in their head of it being referral heavy. And so as we scale, the tables start tipping a little bit more. And they also seem to think that everyone sticks for their first appointment and they don't. So, they think of, I just got to get in front of them. Well, I don't know if that's necessarily even the case also. So to that point, they may have started off that way with referrals or Aunt Betty or, their family because everyone's closing, but that isn't necessarily the case when we start getting colder and colder leads and working farther out. Yeah.
Awesome. So that's 2. What's number 3?
That's 2. Average case size needs to be tracked. This is important because sometimes we think we need more leads or less leads or whatever happens. But if you look at average case size, sometimes that's something we can adjust. Sometimes it's controllable, sometimes it's not. Not really controllable for referrals, right? If someone sends their brother, we're not going to turn them away. But if we're doing dinner seminars and we just feel like we're not getting a lot of good qualified leads, we can up who we're mailing to, or change those specifications. And what that also does is it tells you a lot about your sales cycle. So if there are offices or there are certain sources that are pulling higher average case size, like above 800,000 and above, those sales cycles take longer. So close rates actually kind of drop there because big fish take longer to close. And so it's good for you to know that. There's not a benchmark here, right? Like, I'm not telling you have to have a certain average case size, but your average case size will tell you a lot about what's going on within your story. And that's why it's an important metric to track.
Yeah, I agree. And there's a lot of levers in the business that you can adjust where, a lot of advisors will find themselves kind of reaching capacity, maybe don't want to scale out with additional advisors, but they want to make more money. And the way that you can solve that is just saying no to some of the lower cases and saying, yes, and focusing on the larger cases. And even if you find, as an example, all my big cases come from referrals, and all the cases that are smaller and bogging me down are coming from dinner seminars, let's say, it's like, cool, maybe dinner seminars isn't a fit for that reason. So cool.
Or you can bring on a newer, greener advisor and they can take everyone under 200,000 too. I mean,
Yeah.
talk about scale. And then, and you can do what you love to do or work with the people you love to work with, to your energy point earlier.
Love it.
Cost per client is important. We actually do have a benchmark for that. It varies all over the map. I mean, radio and TV are way more expensive than a dinner seminar. But overall, when you look at all of your marketing funnels combined, including referrals, because those are cheap, we want you to be sitting about a $4,500 cost per client. There's a lot of thoughts and theories on this. And there was a Kitsis article that was introduced to me last week about talking about the time invested from an advisor that's included in the cost. We don't do that. That definition is simply the cost of marketing to our revenue for that client is how we're basically estimating that. So $4,500 for everything: referrals, dinner seminars, radio, TV, not including existing clients. And existing clients kind of function on their own line within our system. So
yeah, and you've probably heard of the company Smart Asset that provides leads. And it's funny, I find that advisors have a very polarizing experience with them. They either absolutely love it or they cancel it as soon as they can. And what I try and share with them is typically they're spending like $1,500, call it $1,000 to $2,000 a month to get X amount of leads. And in their first month, maybe, they don't get anyone, or the ones that love it, they get $1 million client. They're like, this is awesome. And inevitably, whether they had a good experience to start, or if they had a good experience to start, there's going to be a month where they don't close anyone. But I'm glad that you have a metric of that $4,500, because I tell advisors all the time, if you're not, whether it's seminars or, Smart Asset, if you're not willing to continue to feed the beast, so to speak, to allow the ratios to shake out. Because when you think about it, if it's, cost $4,500 to break even, all you need is a $450,000 account, roughly speaking. And that doesn't even take into consideration the fact that they're going to remain a client and most likely continue to add. So if they don't have that long-term focus, it can really get in the way of, because I feel like a lot of times people, regardless of the marketing channel, they stop too early. They don't give it time to pan out. And therefore they're just, continuing to go on to the next thing, and they're never doing anything great or consistent enough to actually experience that result, which is why I think a lot of advisors need to focus heavily on referrals and COIs, especially when they're early on in the business, because they don't have the extra money to take that chance. But when you do have the extra money, like I talked with a guy, he's a prospect of ours, not a client yet, but he's spending like 20 grand a month between radio and TV and, seminars. Like, that's a lot of money. But it pans out over time and he has that long-term focus. So having that metric specifically, I think, can help advisors set expectations. And if you don't want to do it or you don't want to pay it, well, you got to get comfortable asking for referrals and building COI relationships.
Yep. I mean, there's only so far that stuff can get you, and it'll bolster your cost per client down and your ROIs up, and that's great. But if we want to scale and not just be a lifestyle practice, there's a cost there. So that's just part of it, if that's your dream. So, okay, so that's number 4. The last one is, and I hesitate to even say, is ROI. So Pretty much every advisor that comes to us, when they first come to me, they're like, well, what should my ROI be? This is like the first question that I always get. I even hesitate to have benchmarks here, and I will tell you the benchmarks, but ROI is like this false summit. I feel like in our industry, and for anyone who hikes, I mean, it's basically like you think you're to the top and you're not, right? So there's like, it looks like it is, and then we have to go back down and up. So ROI for years has kind of been this: get your ROI here. If it's good, then you're good, and keep rolling with whatever that thing is or whatever. And I don't adhere to that. Reason being is I've seen people be at, I mean, not even in the black for radio for a year, but I'm watching their seminar ROI tick up and they haven't done anything different. And it's simply because they're getting heard on the radio, and then the person gets the invite and then they come to the seminar.
Mm-hmm.
Or another example is digital. So, social media stuff, YouTube, LinkedIn, all of that actually has a phenomenal ROI, but it's not generating the number and thousands of leads that some offices need to keep calendars full. So I wouldn't necessarily say drop everything else you're doing because digital has some great ROI. Well, it's only trickling 15 leads every 2 months. Like, that's not going to keep the calendar full, and it's not going to be producing as much new business as we need it to. So let it be part of your system. Let it be part of the data story. So ROIs are important. They do tell a story, but we have to look at all of them together. And what we tell people, the benchmark for first quarter ROI should be $1. We should be breaking even by like the end of March, maybe April. Why I say that is we spent a bunch of money, January, February, March. Those leads are just now coming in. It takes a very long time in our industry. We're not going to be seeing business getting issued or funded till probably April. So by Q1, all the way up until then, we will be in the red for ROI for all of our sources. Please note that. Speaking of long-term again, right? Like, we have just a very long, lengthy cycle in our industry. And so we're not going to see profits for 3 to 4 months after we've spent that dollar. So at the end of 1Q, we should be sitting at $1. Basically, revenue divided by cost. That's our definition of ROI. We keep it really simple. It's not textbook ROI. You should be hitting $1 to be even. By mid-year, all of our marketing stuff, when we look at all of it together, we should be sitting at about a 250 to a 3 for everything. And then by year end, we should be about a 3, maybe a 4. And if you're AUM heavy, we do recommend people look at like a 3-year ROI. For if they're 70% managed money and only 30% commissions or anything like that, we do recommend doing a 3-year ROI. And at that point, you're just looking at a 3-year payout for AUM, because most of those guys are real long-term thinkers, and we don't have a really high ROI in the first year. So that's at least to be said for AUM heavy people.
Yeah, I'm glad that you alluded to marketing not being a particular strategy like seminars or social media, or it's the marketing machine. And just to share another example like you did, if a client of yours is talking about you to a coworker or a friend or family member, and they go on your website, and then they see that you have some social channels and maybe a YouTube channel, and they watch a video or two. Maybe they read a blog while they're there. And then maybe they see that you're offering a seminar, so they go to that. And then all of a sudden they find out that the accountant that they work with has a relationship with you. And then they finally decide to have a meeting and become a client. What channel gets credit? The machine is the one that gets the credit, right? Having that entire ecosystem. And for that reason, I would very much emphasize and echo your point where it is very difficult to figure out an ROI on a particular strategy because there's so many unknowns as to what they experienced in their journey of deciding to work with you that you need to take into consideration the entire engine that's involved. So very much emphasize that point. When I was looking at your website, there's, slogan, tagline, whatever you want to call it, that basically is input, analyze, identify, and sell. Can you unpack that for me, please?
Yes. It's cool how it all played out, because this was the tagline from the very first day we started, and it's come to mean something a little bit different as we progressed in this field. But with data analytics and storytelling, there's several parts to it. So the first part is gathering information, and advisors know how to kind of delegate this to their team. They'll be like, hey, track all the leads and put them in some Excel sheet somewhere and tell me where they came from. So they're trying to do the input. Their team is trying to do the input. The analyze part is where we start getting lost. So there's this really big disconnect between the advisor doing the selling and doing all of that, and then the team doing some of the tracking. But the advisor doesn't know really what to ask for, but they kind of know what they're looking for. And the team doesn't really know what they're asking for or how to prepare it for them. So there's this really big gap right here. I mean, that's essentially what Track That Advisor fills, right? I mean, that's the problem that we're solving, but it's the analyze and the identify piece. So the analyzation piece, we are helping get the reports that the advisor needs, and then we are telling them what it means, strictly from a definition, strictly me explaining the stars in their constellation of like, this is your constellation. These are the things that matter. Mm-hmm. And then the identify is actually pulling out, okay, well, here are the problems within there. Here's where we're strong. Here is where our sales cycle and client experience is awesome. But when we drop the hammer and we close, we're losing them all. So there's that identifying aspect that we also bring to the table. And then the sell is them going back to what they love doing, right? So that's their energy bucket. And so what we really want them to understand is this is the whole cycle of a client experience. We'll teach your team how to input it. And that's part of our trackers and our processes. We're training them and building it for them. So the input, then we help analyze, help them identify the issues and help them solve that problem. And then they can just go back to doing what they really want to do. And so I feel like that's at least a fairly simplistic way to break down the gap that we're filling, that we're bridging for the advisors and their teams.
I want to share a story and then have you do the same in terms of that process that you just walked through. So when I was at Northwestern and I was in a leadership role, and I'll go to the very, very front end of the activity, which is calling people and trying to book appointments. And it seems extremely tedious, but I would make sure that the new advisors were tracking the amount of times they picked up the phone or sent an email, the amount of times they actually reached someone or got a response via email, and then of those reaches, how many people became an appointment on their calendar. And so if I would see that, I mean, it was pretty obvious if they weren't picking up the phone enough, it's like, okay, we'll pick up the phone. But if they were reaching the amount of people that they should be reaching based on the benchmarks that we had, typically they can reach about 20% of the folks that they reach out to, like in that moment. And of those, the benchmark was you would book 50% of them for an initial meeting. Now, if they were booking 10% of them or 20% of them, what that gave me in terms of insight is, okay, your language that you're using on the phone to book them needs some working on. So part of the importance of tracking is it creates some visibility in your business to where you know what you and or your team needs to work on and button up and improve to increase all the ratios moving forward. So I want to kind of start with that story and kind of tee up you to share kind of a similar story as to some of the things that you found as opportunities by just being aware of the data.
Yeah. And I see it all the time because I'm doing coaching on it. So just a couple of years ago, we were meeting with a client and he had 4 different advisors under him. And there was one that was just not performing well. And he's like, what is going on? I'm ready to fire this guy. Like, he can't close. And he's been on staff for a while. He should know this. Okay. So we pull all the data, we start studying it. And I actually see, and their process was to close in a second. So ask for a commitment in a second. So I look at his close rate from a second to client and it's sky high. It's like 90%. It's actually the highest out of all of the advisors in the office. And I'm like, okay, let's like dig in and be curious here. So I'm working my way back and I see he's losing everybody after a first. He's a super intense guy and he's scaring people off and he's not building relationship and he's not building trust. So he goes from having a ton of leads here and then they just tank here. And of the ones he sets a second with, they all become clients. And it was this great aha moment for my client to say, look, he actually should teach your team how to close. I mean, he's like an incredible closer.
But you got to teach him how to open and build rapport.
Yes. And so, there's that aspect of it. And when we're trying to help other advisors, to do well, the other thing was we were noticing in one of our other clients, their radio leads were not converting to a second at all. And their seminar leads, they do an incredible job of converting them to a second. And so we're sitting here and I'm like, okay, let's think through the difference of these two demographics of people. And we realized, okay, the seminar sat with you for an hour. And you're making the assumption that radio knows you because they've been listening to you. And maybe they're making that assumption as well, but they haven't sat in an hour educational room with you and seen slides and seen the PowerPoint and seen you face to face to create that trust. And so why don't we tweak your first appointment for radio people? Let's make it almost this mini seminar so they can really get to know you face to face. And they did that. And 6 months later, radio conversions were right up to seminars. So those are the types of things to where it's like, not all radio leads were bad. They could have just tossed it out and not done radio because they're not closing radio, but it had nothing to do with that. It literally had to do with their messaging and the leading of the close of the first appointment for them. So that is how the analytics shows the picture, to your point, of these drops, but identifying then the problem and taking action on it is where the gold is, right? Like you can see it here, but if you don't really know what to do or what that means or how to act on it, you're going to continue to have that problem. So I'm glad even you used the verbiage of like identification and then acting on it. That's what solves it. So
yeah, and as we both know, advisors don't track as well as they could. But if you're listening to this, I would highly encourage, whether it's with Erica and her company or just on your own to begin with, to just start tracking, because anything that you can track and measure, you can manage and you can improve, as opposed to just kind of, flying by the seat of your pants and just hoping it works out and toss some money here, toss some money there. It can be difficult because we're all very busy, but it's incredibly important to set aside time to work on your business, because I know you're all spending the majority of time working in your business. And when you kind of hurry up and slow down and, take that overarching view, a lot of times, and I'm sure you can attest to this, Erica, and the folks that you work with, sometimes it's just like a little itty bitty tweak. And then all of a sudden, a lot of the problems were solved. Like, it's not like you have to overhaul your entire business. Oftentimes it's just a tweak here and a twist there, and you're good. I'm curious to know, in your experience, some of the myths that you've had to debunk with advisors. We kind of already hit on a few of them throughout the conversation, but I'm sure you got, whether it be some funny stories or interesting insights as to some of the myths that advisors think through.
Yeah. Oh, there's a lot of them. So, I go to a lot of conferences and I hear all the advisors talking, and my phrase for it is the swagger Olympics. And, you hear someone say, oh, we had our best year ever. And they're both my clients, right? Like, we've got the client, and we'll talk about my book in a minute, but this story is actually in my book of, you got the one who's like, oh, I had the best year ever. And then this one's like, oh, cool. And they're both my clients, and I know their numbers. And I know that this one means, they had their highest production ever, but their ROIs were way down because they spent a ton of money. Mm-hmm. And this one doesn't hear that, right? Like, not that it's a myth necessarily, but it's something I always like to point out is just know your story. And we play the comparison game and we play the competitive game at what makes advisors good at what they do because they're competitive. But I always just want to make sure to point out, knowing behind the scenes and knowing what's happening behind the curtain, that not everyone is like 100% forthcoming of what they mean when they say certain things. And so I think that it's important for advisors to understand that. Another myth that I was thinking about when you were talking about just getting started with tracking is tracking doesn't take a long time. And it can, for the offices go crazy with it who've been doing it for years, but they understand it and it's a tool now and they love it. And so it warrants the time. Most offices, this takes 20 minutes a day. That's a myth that I hear a lot is, oh my gosh, my team doesn't have time for this. Do I need to hire somebody new to do this? And my answer is no. This is 20 minutes a day. This is just, did those people come in for their appointment or not? If we wrote in a business, what business did we write?
I'd argue it's even less than 20 minutes.
Yeah, depending on office size, too. It's a good point.
Well, yeah. So when you think of it in an individual advisor standpoint, like, so at Northwestern, we did what's called like posting and planning. We posted that day's numbers, and then we just planned out the following day and what our intention was for each meeting. And that posting portion, it was, did they keep? Yes or no? What was the result? This or that? Did we get referrals? Yes or no? If so, how many? Like, that takes 4 minutes.
Thank you.
Like,
people find me on 20, and I'm like, I feel like I'm being generous there.
Now, if you're having someone say, I have a client in mind that's out in Washington and kind of the West Coast over there, they have, gosh, I don't know, 30 to 50 advisors or something like that. If you have one person trying to track on behalf of all the advisors, then yeah, that's probably a part-time job. But if every advisor is tasked with spending 3 or 4 minutes at the end of every day, it's not a lot of time. And quite frankly, I think it's required to run a business.
Yeah, it is. And to your point earlier, if there's somebody who likes to do that, get them in there and have them help the advisors do it, because most advisors hate it. And I don't, this is not their personality type.
Oh, I had to get my arm twisted to get in the habit of doing it. But once you're in the habit, it becomes really easy. But especially in sales, it's like, I don't want to do this.
They hate it.
But if you understand the why behind, tracking, then someone like me who's more wired as a salesperson, if you explain the benefit to me and how it's going to make me more money, then I'll track it.
If I can tell you, don't spend another dime this year, like go fix this tiny little spot right here, and you don't have to do one more ounce of marketing, and this will garner you. I mean, mathematically, you can play that out. If we know our close rate, if we know our average case size, I can say, you fix this right here by 10% at an average case size of $500,000 and a close rate of 30%, you're going to be writing $2 million more new business. I mean, it's awesome. It's so cool. So, I mean, I obviously think it's so cool. So yeah, those are probably just a few myths that come to my mind right off the top of my head.
But. Well, and I want to go back to the first one. So, at conferences, and I experience this a lot at Northwestern's conferences, whenever you're kind of catching up with people that you know from the industry, it's a natural thing to do, which is kind of brag about your year or communicate your year and do so with a positive twist on it. But I don't think outside of ego stroking, you're doing anyone favors by kind of positioning it like that. Sure, it may be inspirational. Like I see the guys and gals, up on stage that were making, millions of dollars. I'm like, if they can do it, I can do it. And it can be inspirational, but you're sitting there like, how do I actually do that? So to be able to share with each other, hey, I'm having my best year ever from a production standpoint, but behind the scenes, our current ROI on our activities isn't very good because we've spent so much money on marketing. But here's why we spend so much money marketing. And when you forecast this out 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, it's all worth it. So although on the surface it looks like we're crushing it, we will be crushing it based on the activities that we've done. But here's all the work that it took to actually get there. And then the person that you're talking with isn't just inspired, but they have some, tactical things that they can consider implementing into their business with setting the appropriate expectations, because inspiration can turn to demotivating pretty quickly. So I would encourage everyone who's listening, to Erica's point, don't be afraid to tell the whole story, because it's going to actually help the people that you're talking about or talking to.
Yes.
So I do want to transition slightly, and we're going to talk about your book here in a moment. But if this is your first time listening, one thing I ask all of our guests is a book that's had an impact on them or a book that they've enjoyed. And you picked a book that I have never heard of before, so I'm curious to hear why you picked it. But it's called Run with Horses by Eugene Peterson. And I'm totally judging a book by its, title, not cover. So I have no idea why you picked this book, but I'm curious to know.
Yes, it's Run with the Horses.
Run with the Horses, yes.
Yes, Run with the Horses. So the whole point of the book, and there was even a review, the preface I think is Bono, who did the whole I think it's the preface. But anyway, the whole point of it is we're born with a unique purpose, and it's all about the fact that we're born ahead of time with this purpose, and it's figuring it out and learning it. It's just our natural strengths and abilities and talents that kind of come to this culmination. But then living that out, and it might be scary, and there might be times where there's obstacles, and there might be, things that come up against us, but really standing in that and standing firm in who we are and who we were born to be, because no one else in the world can fill that. To me, I'm on my third time reading it, but for me, who I am a perfectionist and I am a people pleaser in a lot of ways. And so doing what I do in the industry that I do this in, I know I was born to do this. I love data analytics and data storytelling. And I was born to kind of fill this weird gap between advisor and team. But there's a lot of strong personalities, right? Like advisors know what's up and they will speak their opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, just even on a personal, vulnerable front, it's been a lot of overcoming that. And it's been a lot of, I know the data and I know what I'm talking about, and really standing in the truth of the numbers because they don't lie, and having hard conversations, but knowing that I'm bringing a service to our industry and knowing that I'm bringing the unique gifts that I can. And every person has this. I watch advisors and I'm a polar opposite personality type of them. And they're made to be here and do what they do because they are strong and they are resilient and they are incredible and they are creative and they have all these other attributes that I don't have. And so I've just seen, this book play out in my own life. It was really inspirational for me. And yet it also has changed my perspective of everybody else, right? Like if they're finding things that they love, one, hopefully they are doing that, like finding what you were born to do and what you love to do, and then using that because you're really the only person that can do it the way you do it. And that's really inspiring for me. So, yeah.
I like that. And you hit on a scenario in terms of like, could be considered conflict or at the very least, like difficult conversations sometimes that you need to have. And there's a saying that's always stuck with me, which is, in conflict or in difficult conversations, if you can be very direct, but sprinkle it with some grace, it ultimately builds relationships. So continue to stand your ground gracefully. And you've probably experienced it yourself that any resistance that they initially had, they probably end up loving you and working with you and seeing the impact. But that's a saying that I thought of just based on that
I like
overview.
it. I had an advisor once tell me that he loved my coaching because I slit his throat with a feather. So I was like, I'm going to take
That's
that.
interesting. That's direct and graceful.
So that's been what I've stuck to. And I was like, okay, I think that's good. I think I'm doing my job. So
That's funny.
yeah.
So if I'm an advisor, I'm listening to this and I'm like, man, I don't track anything outside of like what my CRM tries to capture. How do I reach out to you? What's in your book? You talked about a book that you recently released, so feel free to plug away.
First of all, just want to encourage any advisors, you're not alone. So most advisors kind of know it's important. Some are doing it, some are not, some are doing it and they know it's broken. So to David's point earlier, just start anywhere. Our website, trackthatadvisor.com, we have a resources page and it has so much stuff. So it's got where to start, the top 5 things to track. It's got the benchmarks. They're all free. You don't have to be a client of ours. One of our number one values is to educate. So if we could do that for you and be a resource, go there and look at the resource page just to get started. Yes, my book just came out. It's called Tracking Your Trek. And it's very much like a workbook mentality. And so that's also a really cool resource for advisors. The whole point of why I wrote it was to cover the CEO hat versus the salesperson hat. At the end of every chapter, there's like places for you to do work and answer questions and kind of work through your business. And so it's very much a workbook setting. So that's another resource for you. But if you want to learn more, just even about what we're doing at Track That Advisor, the best places to start is you can either fill out a form on our website. It says contact us and you do it there, or you can email hello@trackthatadvisor.com and ask away. You can ask any questions if you want to know about benchmarks or just be more educated, or if it's really learning our systems to see if we could potentially work together, then I can do a demo of the sheets as well. So we are open for anything. Our sheets work and they're incredible and I believe in them, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't do it on your own either. So we really want to encourage people, try it on your own. If you come up against something or you're sick of doing it on your own or it's broken, let us help fill that gap for you. But it is important and it should be getting done. So our website's the best place, hello@trackthatadvisor, or you can get Tracking Your Trek online. So
awesome. Well, I can tell, Erica, that you love what you do. You're passionate about what you do. We're similar in that we do our best to add as much value on the front end, knowing that A, it's going to help, and B, it's going to increase the likelihood that, we're able to do business with advisors out there. And so I appreciate you joining. And I was going on your website as you were chatting, because usually what I do, if one of our guests has a book, is I say, hey, if you guys leave us a review, send me a screenshot of the review. I'll go ahead and buy 10 copies. So just, send me your information and I'll get that out. But I am pleasantly surprised that the book is free. So I just scooped one up. So thank you in advance. And I would encourage you guys to do the same, but still leave a review. That would be super helpful. I just don't know.
They do need to go to our website to request it though, because if you go to Amazon, you have to pay for it. So go to our site and then request it.
Okay, cool.
Yes.
Cool. Good call.
Yeah.
Well, fortunately, my computer has all my information saved. So I just clicked the name and it pre-populated everything. So you'll have, you got to send me one now. So thank you.
Yes.
But yeah, definitely scoop that up. Erica, this has been a pleasure. And I would just echo the various points that we made by saying, track something, start somewhere, get in the habit of just tracking something and then build upon that habit. And if you need some help, raise your hand and, don't be afraid to, either check out the resources tab or reach out to Erica directly. So thank you so much for joining and looking forward to continuing to build our relationship moving forward.
Likewise. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
No problem.